Hello, my friends. This is live stream number 2 in this series. I'm Joe. Today we're going to be talking about my upbringing as part of a two-part called Developing My Values. I want to give you all some insight into where I came from, what has influenced me, and at the same time give you some reflection on how that has set me up for the person that I am now. I'm joined by my friend Josh, as always. Hey, Josh.
Yeah. Hey, Joe. Great to be back and very excited to learn more about you. And as I was just saying, so to say your story. So yeah, why don't we kick it off where it usually begins? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your childhood? I know it took place in Wisconsin, not a place I am familiar with. So tell us about it.
Yeah, so I grew up as the oldest of 8 kids. Um, 6 girls, 2 boys. My brother and I are separated by about 6 years, so there's 4 girls between, 2 after. We grew up in rural Wisconsin, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, between two towns, but I think our address was officially in Pembine, Wisconsin. Um, by recent memory, the population of that town is about 1,100 people. So, yeah.
I thought I grew up in a small town.
Yeah, well, and we didn't really engage too much with the community that we lived as a part of. Um, I grew up in a very religiously influenced home, specifically Christianity. My dad was a pastor for most of my childhood, up into my early 20s. He was, serving in some kind of capacity in churches. And we grew up in a pretty, I think, tight knit, fundamentalist Christian space. I'll define that real quick so you have a little bit of context for it, because that terminology might not quite click. Fundamentalist Christians, generally speaking, take a very literal interpretation of the Bible. And a lot of the teaching is focused around behavior. There is a standard for dress, there's a standard for the kinds of music that you listen to. And, we grew up with all of those standards pretty heavily ingrained. My dad was a professor. In addition to being a pastor, he was a professor at a private Christian university in Wisconsin called Northland, which is now defunct. And so we just kind of lived that life, up until I was about 10 years old. I had not really been exposed to anything other than a very structured, faith-based environment. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that is interesting. But it's just like you didn't know anything else, right? It was just the way
Yeah.
that you kind of grew up. Or were you able to see other aspects at that young age and have questions or start to think about why it's different or why
Oh,
you
not really.
yeah.
I think that um, the environment we grew up in was also very protected.
Mm,
I remember listening to a pastor talking about public school and how if you send your kids to public school, they're going to end up on drugs and engaging in all other kinds of illicit activities. And that was, by the way, a big justification for the homeschooling.
yeah.
I was homeschooled until really about fifth grade, and it was in large part because we were told that if you send your kids to public school, they're going to be influenced in ways that you might not like. Um, I'm not going to, make statements now about whether or not that's right or wrong here. It's just kind of what we were told, right? And my parents were pretty young. My dad was 25, my mom was 20 when they got married, And that meant that they were raising me, into like a little toddler kid, around their
Yeah.
late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
And so, we were not really given the opportunity, I think, to chase down other perspectives. And in fact, we were pretty actively discouraged from doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. But you know, and it's also, yeah. I mean, I think the young age plays a factor into some of that mindset too. Like, I'm 30 years old. I can imagine having a kid 8 years ago,
Hmm.
right? Like, 5 years ago. So,
Oh my
um,
gosh, yeah. Like I reflect on my parents now. When when you're young, I think you see the adults in your life as not necessarily having it all together, but you aren't really critical, I think, of who they are and of what they're doing. And as I've looked back on my parents and the decisions that they made, I recognize where I am now in them, and I
mhm,
see, a 20 something woman who had 8 kids in 9 years,
mhm,
all single births, by the way. My mom was very strong.
yeah,
Um, and trying her best,
yeah,
right? Trying her best to like raise kids in a way that made sense, that conformed with her values. I don't fault my parents for not really giving us that kind of exposure. I think that they were very worried about those influences,
right.
and so they didn't want us exposed to that because they were worried about what it might do to us,
Hmm.
right? Um, but again, I don't think that's because they were intentionally trying to keep
Yeah,
us from those things. We just didn't have a frame of reference for what that would mean. Um,
right. And they had this sense of community, this religious based community, and folks that are doing the same things, believing the same things. So that's incredibly important. And yeah,
yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting to hear. I come from Jewish background, and kind of broke that off a generation before me. Both of my parents were very strict and
Hmm.
very religious in terms of that. So it's interesting to hear that story. And I know when we kind of dive into the next section, and as you said, you were homeschooled up till fifth grade. So I'm curious to see kind of how we made that transition, what happened after fifth grade. So I know
Sure.
that's coming up, but really
Yeah.
appreciate the background here so far, Joe.
Absolutely. Let's make the switch, and then we'll come back here.
Yeah, sounds good.